mentioned earlier that you were interested in getting to understand the modes a little bit better. The basic idea for the major scale is whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half, which I'm sure you know. And then basically the modes are comprised of different positions of the major scale. When we hear, separation between notes, whether it's, an octave, or if it's a fifth or third. These are all just intervals. They're all just spacing between notes. And so that's the key thing to understanding really any type of scales or any type of music or music theory at its most basic level. So we have our intervals, whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. We know those are our intervals that make up the major scale, right? And I'm sure you're familiar with the common major scale position. This is what we're going to be using to kind of figure out the other modes and how they lay in on the fretboard in reference to whatever the key is that we're playing in. For this video's sake, it's going to be an E. So first we need to know the major scale position. Let's play it here on the 5th string, on the E string on the 5th fret. Right? So that's it. Simple enough. We have our major scale. Now that can be played, on any position, and wherever the root note is, which is where you're starting, with this finger. E major scale would start on the 12th fret. Okay, so that scale right there is the first position of the modes, or the first mode, and it just being a major scale. That's all it is. Right? So that's Ionian. Easy enough. Now, the key to playing the modes is that they're only relevant to the root that you're playing it over. I could take that same pattern and I could play that was Mixolydian in the exact same scale. The only difference is that there's no root note to reference by. Any type of the modes of what we're doing, we have to put something in the background. So I'm just going to use my looper to give us an E, and we'll start with Ionian. And remember, we're just playing that major scale shape, but we're starting on the 12th fret. Whoops. You can hear, as soon as I hit one wrong note, you can hear the difference. Now that note may have been a part of another mode, but when you're playing it in reference to a particular mode, it stands out as wrong because we're hearing them in these specific groups known as modes. The next, or the second mode, is known as Dorian, okay? And that one, what we're going to do is we're just going to start on the 10th fret instead of starting on the 12th fret. So we take that same pattern, the major scale, and that becomes Dorian mode, and it's a minor-based scale with some little differences from the natural minor, which is Aeolian, but it's still a minor scale. Now, the key part of this is that if Ionian starts on the root on E, what happens is we make E the second note of the scale. So in order to make it the second note of the scale, we just slide it down 2 positions. So we have a full step between Dorian and Ionian. So now this is the first note of the scale. The second note of the scale is our E. When the E is the second note of the scale, we're now in a minor Dorian. And here's how it sounds. Makes sense, right? Root note's Ionian, second is Dorian. If we're starting on if E is the third note of the scale, of the major scale, then we're in Phrygian. We're at the 10th, move it down to the 8th. Now E becomes the third note in the scale. 1, 2, 3. That note is an E. Right? So now we're in Phrygian mode. Let's see how it sounds. Okay, that's Phrygian. I hope you're starting to see a pattern here with how easy this can actually be. And, you know, this isn't going to teach you the modes in every single position everywhere on the fretboard. This is going to give you an idea of what the modes are and what they're supposed to sound like. Because if we're just mindlessly playing scales all over the fretboard, just have these patterns that we know, but we're not really applying our ear to it. What these modes do is they help to reference tones in the way that, you know, we hear music, and that's really what these are meant to do, or what they really help us to do as musicians, to see music in tones as opposed to just mindless patterns. We're getting into a couple of my favorites. Next is Lydian, and this one we're just going to move down a half step. 1, 2, 3, 4. So now that's the fourth note of the scale, is known as Lydian. Here we go. This one sounds good. Give an idea what this should sound like. So you get the idea. That's Lydian. The next position we're going to move on to is Mixolydian, or the fifth position, fifth mode. This is another one I really like. Here's where we are in reference. So we did Ionian, Dorian, Phrygian, Lydian, and then now we're down to Mixolydian on the fifth. Because this is the fifth position, that means that our E should line up with the fifth note of the scale. So you can always check it to see if you're, so we're going to start on the fifth fret. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Sounds like an E to me. We'll see how that sounds. Mixolydian. Two of my favorites personally are Mixolydian and Lydian. Lydian. Mixolydian. Okay, moving on to the next. Aeolian is the natural minor. This one's a real common one. And this one's going to be played on the third fret. So we were at 5 with Mixolydian, moved down a whole step to the third fret, and suddenly we're the natural minor Aeolian scale, or mode. Here we go, this is how it sounds. You can't play a minor without distortion. Okay, and the last and final, which is the 7th note of the scale. If we put our E as the 7th note of the scale, we have Locrian, or the 7th mode. This one can be played down on the 1st fret, but because it uses open strings, it gets a little more complicated. So we're going to play this one instead of the 1. We'll move it up an octave. We'll play it on starting on the 13th fret, and this is Locrian. This is kind of a weird scale, or a weird sound. It's definitely not one of my favorites. It's used a lot in jazz playing, and there are certain chords that it works really well over, so it's good to know. So, in a nutshell, those are the 7 modes, and more than just memorizing them as patterns, I would use this method and use it with, some sort of backing looper or effect or play an open string. But I would use this method to train your ear and just practice, the different positions, different modes over a root note like that. But really the idea behind this is not just memorization. It's not just, we can just memorize scales and patterns and things like that. Somebody said you play Phrygian somewhere, starting on the, 7th fret. You know that pattern just because you memorized it, but what does that mean when it comes to music? This method, in my eyes, is more of an ear training. It's more of, what does Phrygian sound like? What makes Phrygian different than Lydian? But I want to sound, more breezy and airy and exotic with a major than just playing an Ionian major scale. I would choose something like Lydian, which is based off a major scale, but it just has a really cool sound to it, kind of unlike the major scale, which we kind of get bored of, or the Ionian mode. So anyway, this is just one concept that you can use to kind of, further your understanding of what the modes are and how they're used and why they're important. Hope this helps a little bit. I hope my playing didn't stink too much, and talk to you later.